there ain't no stopping us. Fly without boarding pass. Couldn't catch me, I'd be moving fast. Call me a shooting star. Let 'em know who you are. Flying up in a bar. Wish on a star. Time to show 'em who's in charge. Call me a shooting star. Didn't even get to cross.
Hey BTC, it's your boy DJ Barbecue, and we got a special episode today. We have a special guest. We have a new sponsor, and let me tell you, this really makes BTC UnCut Live a lot more powerful, because BTC UnCut Live is powered by kback.rocks. kbackradio.com, what rock radio really is. Now, today's guest, we have our ever so popular, our professor guru behind the scenes, our merchandise king, Jon Putzier. Jon, how you doing today?
I'm glad to be here. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. Thank you for calling in. I appreciate it. First off, why don't you tell the audience and the listeners a little bit about yourself if they don't know you?
Well, I basically am the guy behind. I'd like to consider myself of behind the curtain, if you will.
Right on.
A lot of the stuff that you see, a lot of the stuff that is kind of like the visual aspect of behind the curtain. I'm sort of the guy behind that. So I guess I don't know how else to put it, man.
So, everybody has a story about how they started or what attracted them to professional wrestling. Why don't you give us a little insight? What caught your eye? What really, stung you about professional wrestling?
Well, that let's see, man. I guess wrestling has always been in my life, like from day one. It's literally been with me since before I have any memories. My dad, my dad grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and back in the 70s and the 80s, when the NWA was still divided into territories. There was the Pacific Northwest Territory. They had a show called Portland Wrestling. My dad did ring crew for the promoter Don Owen, and he basically worked all those shows. They had a very set schedule that they would have throughout the state of Oregon, Washington, and I was essentially born into that, like while my dad was still doing some of those shows. Now, by the time I was born, the Portland Wrestling and that territory of the NWA was pretty much on its last legs, 88.
Okay.
So, it was basically, it wasn't too far off before they went belly up. But I was, however, in my very first wrestling show that I was in attendance for was a taping of Portland Wrestling at the old Portland Sports Arena, and hopefully some of you in the group will know what I'm talking about, because this, I've always considered Portland Wrestling to be the forgotten territory of the NWA, because you go on WWE Network and you see the archives, and they have Mid-Atlantic, they have Georgia Championship Wrestling, they have the old WCW on TBS, whatever it is. Portland Wrestling, I call it the forgotten territory because Don Owen, the promoter, made the fateful decision way back when to not archive his shows. So, with that being said, the only footage that exists today of Portland Wrestling is that fans happen to tape on their home VCRs.
Right.
So,
You're definitely right about that with the Portland territory, because you don't really hear about it as much as that you should. Even there's some Google searches, if you do now with this generation. And when I say this, I kind of date myself. I'm really back in the day. I was born in the '80s, so I kind of was fortunate enough to know a little bit about a lot of these different territories. And Portland is one of those ones that you're correct. It's not well known. People don't really talk about it. And yeah, it was unfortunate that he never
And
did
so
archive his
many
videos.
Yeah, and so many just major names in the business came from there. Like, Jesse Ventura got his start in Portland wrestling. I have I have a lot of clips that I've gathered throughout the years, of different from different people that I know, because I live in Oregon. So I've made connections with a lot of people who lived through that time period, and I've been able to collect a sizable amount of footage over the years. And I got stuff that would just it's crazy, man. Imagine Jesse Ventura, basically not able to talk. I mean, Jesse Ventura is known as one of the better talkers in the industry, and when he was here in Portland, he basically was known for just coming up in front of the camera and posing. He couldn't talk. I mean, he basically couldn't talk. I mean, but yeah, I have a friend of mine. So one of the main guys that came from Portland was a guy named Playboy Buddy Rose. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but Playboy Buddy Rose actually was that sort of helped Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty kind of moved up to the next level in their careers. There is sort of a legendary match that took place in the AWA. On their AWA at the Showboat, the ESPN show that they used to do, and basically, yeah, Buddy Rose was one of the main guys in Portland, but he made it a point to tape every episode of Portland Wrestling himself. I mean, he was kind of the top guy of the territory, and when he passed away, he sort of left the largest existing collection of Portland wrestling footage in one place. And kind of it got left to a guy that I know pretty well, and actually, so now the biggest collection of Portland footage that exists is someone that is really close to me, so it's kind of interesting.
Well,
But,
when you were discussing that, Jesse the Body Ventura came from the Portland territory, and a lot of the listeners and the watchers may not know that. And they may not know a lot of other ones. Do you know anybody else other than Jesse Ventura that was actually in that promotion?
definitely by far the biggest name is Roddy Piper. But just to name a few, just off the top of my head, let's see, Jimmy Superfly Snuka, the Iron Sheik, Kurt Hennig, along with his dad Larry the Axe Hennig. Let's see, the grappler Len Denton. Actually, Len Denton, he was actually a guy that went on to World Class, had a bunch of matches with Bruiser Brody. Nord the Barbarian, who went on to the WWF to be known as the Berserker.
Yep.
Crush, Brian Adams Crush. Let's see, who else? I mean, there's a lot of guys, man.
And by
Rocky
this point
Johnson,
right now, the viewers and the listeners are probably having their jaw drop, because a lot of them don't know this, and
right.
and this is an education that I really hope that the new generation of professional wrestling fans actually listen to, because this is actually a who's who of Hall of Famers, or potential Hall of Famers in this promotion. And so, yeah, just I had to say that. Just go ahead, because it's amazing with this promotion and the talent that came out of there.
Yeah, Rocky Johnson was there. One of the coolest things that I have as a personal just memory for myself is I was in attendance for Monday Night Raw. I believe it was in Portland, Oregon, at the Rose Garden Arena, and I believe it was 2012. It was like the build up to WrestleMania 28. It was like once in a lifetime Cena versus Rock, I believe, and The Rock was basically the final segment on Raw, where he basically I don't know if you remember how like him and Cena had this big Twitter war thing going on at the time.
Yeah, yep. That's where that whole thing started from.
Right, and so this was actually the first time that The Rock had appeared in the state of Oregon on WWE television, and actually, I think that's kind of an interesting story too. Is why didn't the WWE or WWF, why didn't they come to the state of Oregon for almost 20 years? But I'll get to that. So after the show goes off the air, so Rock cuts his big promo against Cena and everything. But then after the show goes off the air, he then pauses and takes the time to acknowledge that most of you don't know this, but The Rock used to live here in Portland, Oregon. Talk about how his dad, Rocky Johnson, like ran through the territory, and how The Rock would be sitting there at ringside as as like a 12-year-old.
Right.
And the arena that they ran out of. So Portland Wrestling, one of their big promotion points that they used back then was that they were one of the only NWA territories to come to you live weekly from an actual arena, because at the time most NWA territories their weekly live show was in a television studio.
Right.
And so Portland Wrestling was in a arena. Now this arena, it was called the Portland Sports Arena. It was in the industrial district of Portland, in North Portland. And what it actually was, it was a renovated bowling alley that Don Owen, the promoter, bought. And essentially, like, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of kind of like what the ECW arena came to be.
Right.
It had a very, like, the way that fans of Portland Wrestling talk about that building is very similar to how fans of the original ECW talk about the original ECW arena. So really, if we're being honest, the Portland Sports Arena was a shithole.
Right.
This was back in a time where you were allowed to smoke in the arena. There was no barricades. There was my dad has amazing stories. My dad would be doing ring crew, and I guess there was this 85-year-old lady, and her nickname was Ringside Rosie, and she would bring she would bake cakes and stuff for the wrestlers, and the wrestlers were very fond of her. Like, they would come to the shows looking forward to this 85-year-old lady to bring them like a homemade German chocolate cake or whatever it is, and just stuff like that. I mean, there's a documentary that actually I have a YouTube channel that I've had up for several years that and one of the videos I have posted is an old documentary that ran on local Oregon PBS television about Portland wrestling, and it's got no narration or anything. It's just filmed 16 millimeter film footage, and it just shows you kind of what the atmosphere of the building was like. And I maybe I'll tag a link with it for you here when you post this, because I think that it's crazy to look at how the atmosphere was, because these fans believe this stuff so much. I mean, we talk about kayfabe and all this type of stuff, but like this I can't convey to you enough how like this was real. Like, I mean, this is kayfabe. I mean,
right.
I don't.
This is when they were living the gimmick, and the gimmick had to be lived on both sides. One thing that I want to just break in here and tell the listeners and viewers once again, that if you do see this link or you see any type of possible footage, I mean, there's not really a lot there, but if anybody has a snippet of it, even though that it doesn't look like, and it looks like a crappy situation, a crappy building, that actually was ahead of its time at that time when they were doing wrestling shows. Because like you said, normally they were just in, little studios and that. This was actually, in a real arena. It wasn't a made up, production studio. So they were really ahead of their time at that point. It was kind of like the concept of the Sportatorium in Texas, where the Von Erichs
Yep.
were at. But I just wanted to break in there and explain to the listeners and the viewers, that's exactly what it was. It was ahead of its time. It wasn't ever really done that well, or done before, because they wanted to have every part of the show controlled. And this was a kind of a way that, you had to really push to go get those ticket sales. And when you were saying about the old lady that was there, that's the way it was. It was almost like a family feel. That you could have had any of these guys, any of these fans bring whatever, and you didn't have to worry about somebody doing something dumb or stupid.
And especially in this particular territory, because one of the unique things about Portland, and I've actually heard Pat Patterson talk about this in an interview, because Pat, there, I when I was running down names earlier, I'm leaving out a ton of people, but Pat Patterson's another guy that came through, and he talked about one thing is that Don Owen, the promoter, was always known as one of the better payoff guys in the business, because it was it was easy for a guy to get kind of fucked over back in the day.
Yeah, kind of get rubbed
if
the
you
wrong
weren't
way.
if you weren't a top guy, it'd be really easy to get paid another thing. But that being said, so one of the unique things about Portland is the fact that it's very light travel in reality, because they had a set weekly schedule where they would go from town to town to where they would basically run the same town on different nights every week. They would always run Portland on Saturday night, because that's where the sports arena was, that's where the television was. They would run Eugene, which is about 100 miles south of Portland. That's actually where I live. And then they would run Salem, that's the capital. That's about 50 miles. It's kind of in the middle between Portland and Eugene. So basically, these cities are essentially within close proximity of one another. And the way Pat Patterson described it is that it was nice because, say, compared to Texas, the Dallas territory, the amount of travel that you would have to do between towns was insane compared to Portland. If you were in Portland, you could do a show in Eugene. Yeah, it's 100 miles, but you could still drive and be home in an hour and a half. And one thing a wrestler loves, you can ask almost any wrestler, be it a current guy or an old timer, any chance that a wrestler has to sleep in their own bed, they will jump on it, even if it means that they have to travel a few hundred to do it.
Right.
So
some of those wrestlers that you were mentioning, that went to the Portland territory, and that, how long were they there? And I guess I should clarify a little bit better. How long did that territory last? Do you know?
So Portland. Well, let's see. It actually, the Portland Wrestling television show, at the time that it aired its final episode, the final official episode of Portland Wrestling was I apologize if I'm getting the date off by 1 or 2 days, but I believe it was December 21 was the final episode of Portland Wrestling. And the first thing you see on that show is Roddy Piper showing up to give Don Owen a plaque, and this plaque commemorates Don Owen. They had been airing Portland Wrestling on local television in Oregon and the surrounding Northwest areas for 35 straight years. And at the time, it was actually considered to be one of the longest running television shows in the entire United States. Believe it or not, it's kind of crazy. The only show that had it beat was Meet the Press.
But those were easier
which
times back then to be able to do television shows. I mean,
definitely.
granted, yes, you have technology into doing it, but there's so much more involved with technology now. Yeah, there might not be that big of a viewership around the nation, and some of them were lucky. Like if the ones that got on the Turner Network, then they'd be pretty much made, and that's what everybody tries to go for. Um,
Yep.
but with that, what would be some of the best factions to come out of Portland?
As factions went, it's kind of weird. I mean, like they didn't so much do like factions per se. The one faction that really comes to mind right off the bat, and these aren't guys that are so well known, I guess, but there was a faction called the Clan, and it consisted of three guys. It was basically a guy like the lead guy was a guy named Rip Oliver. Um, Rip Oliver was Dallas territory, and I believe also. Now I'm gonna have to please fact check me on this if I got this wrong.
Oh, and yes,
I'm
we've always said that to our listeners and viewers. At any point in time, go ahead and fact check us. We encourage that. Put it down in the comments, and make sure that we know. And that's what they're for. We appreciate that we have listeners and viewers do that.
You remember how Andre the Giant was the Machine at one point?
Right.
He was under a mask. It was kind of a Japanese kabuki style mask.
Yep.
He actually had a tag team partner, and I believe for a time that Rip Oliver was that guy under the mask, like the smaller Machine. He also, I know that Rip Oliver, even though he didn't make it to television with it, he was one of the guys that was initially considered to be in Demolition.
Right, that is true.
And so another guy was that was in that faction was let's see, I believe it was it was like Brickhouse Brown, and I believe he went on to like ECW and WCW. Never really he never really made it big. I think he was also in like, but like as far as factions go, I mean, I think it was more about like just they had like a very big core of just like guys who were like their like main guys like that were like their mainstays that even though these guys would travel around the country, they would always come back to Portland, and Portland would be considered home to them. And one of the interesting facts is that for any of you that have read Roddy Piper's autobiography, Roddy Piper made it a point to say to Vince McMahon when he signed. Actually, I don't even know that Roddy Piper signed a contract for a long time when he was with Vince McMahon, but he made it a point to tell Vince McMahon, I will never, ever, ever work a WWF show in the state of Oregon because I can't compete against Don Owen. The guy has been too good to me and has done too much for me, and I could never do that to him. And even like in like 1989, this would have been around the time of WrestleMania 5. That's the time where Roddy Piper did the Piper's Pit with Morton Downey Jr., where he sprayed him with the fire extinguisher with Brother Love there.
Yep.
So right around that time, he was making regular appearances in the WWF, but he would also be flying back to Oregon every single week. And that's another collection of tapes that I have that I think is pretty cool, is Roddy Piper in 1989 appearing on Portland Wrestling Television. It's actually pretty remarkable when you think about it, that a guy that is appearing regularly for the WWF during that period of time would be appearing on this little local NWA territory television show on a regular basis at the same time.
Right.
It's actually pretty unheard of. But Piper was allowed to do it. I mean, Piper that's just somehow he was able to work that out. And You know, he started big with Nord the Barbarian, who, like I said, went on later on to become the Berserker in the WWF. There was another guy there, and this is a guy that a lot of you might be familiar with, a guy by the name of Art Barr. Art Barr was tag team partners in Mexico with Eddie Guerrero. He was called the Love Machine, Art Barr, and I really, really encourage you guys to go look up their tag team matches. There is a famous pay-per-view called When Worlds Collide. That is like I think it's like a tag team tournament of sorts. There is a fantastic match involving the Love Machine, Art Barr, and Eddie Guerrero. And actually, fact is that Eddie Guerrero took the frog splash from Art Barr. And when Art Barr did a frog splash, and there's footage of this on the WWE Network even, I believe. When Art Barr did a frog splash, it's hard to explain. He actually looked like a frog when he would do it. Like the way that he would do the motion when he jumps got so much bend when
Right,
he would
his
when he
body
would be in
movement
the
and
air.
his aneurysms were a little bit more froggish.
Yeah,
It
he
looked
literally
more
looked
of
like
a
a frog leaping.
frog influence type of actually frog splash, and that's where they got the terminology from.
One thing that happened to me is that I was very, very young, but I met Art Barr at a Carl's Jr. restaurant, and he died 2 weeks later. He I think like all the stories I ever read was that he basically just died in his sleep, but I'm sure that there was some other stuff involved with that. I don't want to speculate on it, but yeah, I mean, I Art Barr, but then hearing just a few weeks later that he had passed away, that he's a guy that would have been pretty. He had so much potential. He very well could have been a huge name in the business.
Right.
He actually Roddy Piper in Portland Wrestling gave him a gimmick, which ultimately I would imagine that there was some copyright guys that were jumping all over this, but there's this famous promo where Roddy Piper basically says, "You're too generic," and he makes him take his tights off and like all this stuff. He makes him basically strip down to his underwear in the middle of the interview set, and then he has him put on like a pair of Zubaz pants and like a denim jacket. Then he like put on his face and dumps baby powder on his head, and he says, "You are now called Beetlejuice." And he was Beetlejuice from that point on. And you can look it up. He was in WCW for a period of time under the name The Juicer, because obviously like I said, there's going to be some copyright issues with the name Beetlejuice.
Right.
So,
Right.
but
Well, the Portland territory is a like you said, is a very unknown, not as talkative about promotion. Why don't we, before we end the show here, let's leave some for the next show, because we've already decided as we were doing this that we were going to do this in a couple parts and talk more individual territories, and we'll go into more detail on other aspects of professional wrestling. But I want to always end the show with a couple questions, and I kind of just change the questions around all the time. The one question I would like, and it can be from the past, the present, or the today. And when I meant present, I meant like, the different eras of professional wrestling that we've seen in the mainstay or independent. What would be your favorite heel of all time? Or you can add, a couple in there, but what would be, you would feel as, in your opinion, be your favorite heel?
I mean, I've got to go with Roddy Piper. I mean, I know it's a cliche guy to pick, but you know what? It doesn't matter to me because yeah, Roddy Piper lived to piss people off, and he always just kept himself in character. I mean, I don't even know if you could say in term to use with Roddy Piper. I think Roddy Piper was who he was, and whether he was a good guy or a bad guy, like within like the booking, I think that he was always kind of had that heel aspect to him at heart.
Right.
And yeah, Roddy Piper, just the way that guy could talk and get heat just by anything. I mean, he's one of the greatest. He's one of my all-time favorites.
Well, let's go flip the concept from a single star. Who do you think was the greatest heel tag team?
Tag team. Kind of putting me on the spot here. I've always been a fan of if you ever go back and watch like the NWA, like Georgia Championship Wrestling, and watch talking about Arn Anderson, I'm talking about Ole and Gene Anderson. Now I'm going way old school right here, but these guys just again, this is when it was absolutely real, and this is when the majority of fans kind of believed what was going on here. And it was a lot. I guess it would have been a lot easier for these guys to get heat. But anyways, like these guys were just amazing. You'd have to just go back and watch their stuff. I would very much recommend it if you have never checked their stuff out before.
Right. Well, Jon, I appreciate you coming on. We're gonna do, like I said, a few different parts of this episode. But for right now, I'd like to once again thank Jon for being on the show. I'd like to thank KBack.Rocks for powering us up and keeping us rocking and rolling. I'd like to also thank Midwest All Pro Wrestling for being our main sponsor as well. And White Claw. Like they say, if you ain't drinking White Claw, you just ain't living. Jon, I appreciate it. We will do part 2 here soon. And everybody out there, have a good night.
Shooting stars across the galaxy. I stand out, so don't be mad at me. Infiltrate with my strategy. When I turn up, they never just have to leave. Yeah, shooting. Yeah, shooting. Yeah, shooting. Yeah, shooting shots. Shooting stars. Didn't even get to cross.